Let's go ahead and get started today. Happy Wednesday. And hey, we have a long weekend ahead, which is always fun. So I think it's recording. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Here we are. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and open up Rhino. We'll just go through some stuff. So today I'm just going to go over the perspective that's due for 367 of one of your systems here. Just one perspective formatted on 11 by 17. Okay, so if it fits portrait on 11 by 17, it doesn't have to be full bleed or anything, but you know, if it's close to 11 by 17, then that's perfect. And I'm just going to quickly run through some things here. I'm going to go ahead and open up my model file, but one of the first things I'm going to do, and this is a workflow that that we prefer in 267 and 367, is we're not usually producing a lot of shaders and maps and things like that to render out. We're usually doing some basic renders that we can then pull into Photoshop and then start to bling things out in Photoshop. And so that's the kind of workflow that I'm going to do today. Everybody has their own preferences and what battles they want to fight with rendering versus where they want to fight in post-production in Illustrator or Photoshop. I err more towards the side of, you know, getting into those Adobe suite apps and fixing a lot of things later, because I always am adjusting things anyway in those. It's just a habit. Really quickly, you know, again, just to reiterate the fact, you know, here's one of my models. Ridiculous model. Look at that. Lots and lots of stuff. You can see I have a little bit of science fiction here, some fantasy items just sort of floating in space. I can always go through and try to delete those out. But honestly, when I was just sort of trying to situate myself in the model, I didn't even see those. So it wasn't even an issue. But what I'm going to do is sort of zoom in and try to find a perfect location to sort of stand from. And here's some of the criteria that I would use while you're making this decision on your own. First of all, by default, the perspective camera in Rhino is much too tight. It's 50 millimeter. 50 millimeter is like, I think it's much too tight of a shot. I would go much lower for the lens length and make it wider angle. To do that again, this is a repeat, but I'm just going to repeat this. You know, right click on the perspective label in this case, go to viewport properties. Over here in the properties box on the right hand side where my cursor is, right, there's lens length. By default, I think your lens for your camera is set to 50 millimeter lens. I would go at least minimum, like maximum would be 35 millimeter, but I would go even wider angle than that, somewhere in the 20s. If you take into account the human eye's peripheral vision, right, where we sort of see things, but they're not quite in focus off to the edge, you know, the human eye is somewhere in the 25 to 28 millimeter range. For mine, I actually picked a lens length of 20. And let me just show you the view that I selected before. What I did is I went to set view, named views, right? And I picked a view out, and once I had it perfectly, I saved it here. So I'm just gonna go back to it now. It's called Perspective 02 in my case, okay? I have a couple of portions that are in the extreme foreground, like going right off next to me, right? As if they're a wall that I'm standing next to, and a couple of other units, neighboring units next to me. I have a midground here with a rather large sort of building across the street. And then I have a background. You know, we start to see more and more urban fabric off in the distance, right? And so I think that's one of the keys here, is to make yourself feel immersed. It helps to have some foreground things, even things coming right out of the frame, right? As if there's a ledge going over you or right beside you, right? It helps make it believable that I'm standing maybe on one of these decks, right? Even if I don't see the deck because I'm on the edge of it looking out. Okay. So to have some of these things in the foreground on the right and the left-hand side is really important. Having some things in the midground, having some things in the background. For my taste, I'm going to do a couple of things here. I'm going to up the DPI, make sure that the size and the DPI are going to be big enough for 11 by 17. You can change these things. For instance, if you go to the dimensions and you say like custom, right? You could always say, let's see, 72 DPI, whatever the DPI is set to. Let's say I set it to 100, right? If I need 11 by 17 rendering, then I can sort of multiply 100 dots per inch. So 100 times 11 and 100 times 17. And I could always enter in a custom thing here where I could say 1100 by 1700, for instance. Right. I'm going to up the quality to good quality or final quality, so things aren't too grainy. Transparent background. I want to make sure that I don't have this white background here or black background. I want to make sure I have a transparent background set. I'm going to make sure the ground plane is turned off in case I need to do something down here in Photoshop, and I want to make sure that that's transparent. I'm going to turn off the sun, although you can play around with having the sun, direct sun. You just got to play around with the intensity of the sun. Yes?
Sorry, but your size is wrong. You didn't delete the last one, so it went.
I'm sorry?
The size that you put in 1100.
Oh, thank you for letting me know that. Yeah, that would be tragic. 1700, let's say, right? So now let's say I'm going to have 100 DPI. I'm going to have 11 by 17 inch document, right? Because I have 100 pixels per inch, and I'm saying 1100 by 1700 pixels. Does that make sense though overall? Thank you for pointing that out. That would be tragic. It would be super long and like a little narrow. Thanks, Allie. Good eye. I've already done the intersect tool here, but what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say render curves and render surface edges. I've turned off the ISO curves, and so I can just, what that's going to do is it's just going to like add these little black, edges in places, and you might like that and you might not like that. You can always save out as both, but I'm going to go ahead and leave those on. And the rendering is going to take maybe a couple of minutes. I'm not going to actually do that in front of you because I've already, like a cooking show, I can sort of put something in the oven and take something out here. Right. So this is what I get out of Rhino. And it's, just a soft shadow rendering of a gray, white, sort of clay model, sort of, it's pretty generic. You can see that I have these edges in, right? So that's kind of a nice thing to give some definition to each edge. But what I'm really going to focus on today then is going from like here, I had like 10 minutes before class, to something like this, right? Where we start to add some materiality, we change the coloration, we start to add some entourage, we definitely play around with the sky, etc. Right? So let's see. First things first, when in doubt, I go to Google image search. So, things like concrete, texture, you can always go to images. You can always add a high resolution tag. You can go to tools and you can change the size and only use large sizes. You can often find some good textures for things like concrete or wood, right? You can find grain or you can find planks, right? And part of this is, my aesthetic here that I'm thinking, it always helps to maybe have something or some examples in mind. But have any of you guys ever been to the Salk Institute in La Jolla? It was done by Louis Kahn, very famous 20th century architect. It's one of the masterpieces of the 20th century. But it's this sort of cast in place concrete with this sort of teak wood infill paneling for these sort of cloistered research facilities, research offices for folks who deal with researching diseases and vaccines for the diseases, named after Jonas Salk. It's in La Jolla, just north of San Diego. If you're ever in that area, I highly recommend going and seeing the Salk Institute. What's wonderful is it's this courtyard, and then you have this channel. And this is a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. It's a magnificent, magnificent piece of architecture. One of the most famous in the universe. And so that's kind of what I was going for here, and just trying to find some textures for wood and concrete. So let's see, I got some blue sky, I got some wood paneling, I have some birds, because that's important, of course. Maybe some balloons, You're like, what? Let's see, where did my concrete go? Trying to find it here. Let's see. There's some concrete. You know, you can always find some balloons, some humans, some scale figures, some silhouettes even, you know, however you want to do that. Trees and vegetation if you'd like to. I only had like 10 minutes, so bear with me here. Let's take a look at this before we start doing these all together. I'm going to start turning off layers. Let's get back to the overall base layer here. All right, so here's my base layer. Again, this is just the rendering saved as a PNG with a transparent background. Behind, I'm going to bring in some sky, right? That was this blue sky, and all I did was sort of turn down some desaturation, maybe even change the coloration a little bit to turn it to warmer blue, give it a little more green. Where'd my example go? Here it is. All right. Down here, you can still see in the, you know, some transparent checkerboard. All I did was take a brush and actually brush in some black, you know, with a feathered brush. So, you know, going, making sure my palette's set to black, get my paintbrush. You know, I'm just using a feathered brush here and drawing, right, to add some stuff there. I don't know why my cursor's so large, freaking large. There we go. All right, sorry about that. So we had sky, then we have this overlay, right? I mean, behind the scene, you know, doesn't really matter what it looks like, right? Really only matters what it looks like here. You know, I noticed there's a little bit of blue sky here where there should probably be some more existing urban area. I don't know if you guys can see where I'm sort of pointing at, you know, inside there, you see that blue sky? So what I did is I just sampled a little bit of this and moved it over, copied and pasted it behind. You can see that here. I'll just turn that layer on. I just threw that in there in the background. You know, it's something you'd hardly even notice, but it helps to sort of solve some of those pesky blue patches that you don't actually want to see because they're too low in the skyline. All right. Then what did I do? I added a concrete material and made it an overlay just over the portions that I wanted to do. Then I started to add some of this wood paneling. So here's some wood decks I added. And then again, using some of the, let's see, the dodge and burn tool here. Let's see, 70, where I can start to paint some, oh, sorry. Me help if I selected the right layer. Where I can start to just darken some things up around the edges here to make it a little more three-dimensional, right? Same thing with, you know, adding, let's say, wood up here in some places to make it look like added some wood paneling here, added some wood paneling there. You know, I could go through and start to do this in different surfaces, right? In this case, I also added a coloration layer. You can see I just gave it a little bit of warmth, right, with some yellow going to green. Added some birds or, you know, balloons or humans or, you know, maybe some contrails going through the sky. You know, maybe this is Las Vegas where you always see either natural critters or man-made critters traveling through the air in a given moment. All right, and so let's just build this up step by step now. You sort of get a sense for what's going on here. So again, this is my PNG. Once I start to do some things in here and I start to build up some layers, I'm going to save this as a PSD. PSD Photoshop documents, as you know, are those original Photoshop, native Photoshop files that preserve all of these layers. And so you can always go back in and start to tweak things and then resave out a JPEG or a TIFF later on to insert into your posters or your design boards, right? For printing and plotting.
So there is no need to worry here about line weights, correct?
Yeah, this is a perspective. So I'm not bringing any line work.
Okay.
What I did is I rendered with edges on. So that's why I have some of those black edges.
Okay.
Okay.
Making sure.
Okay, a couple things. I'm just going to bring in the sky. Let's try looking about the background really quickly. I'm going to bring in this blue sky. Just select all, so Control A, copy, Control C, and I'll go back to my example here, and I'm going to add a layer, hit the plus sign over here in the layers box, hit Control V, right? Command V for Mac, Control V for Windows. I'm actually using my Mac side, so Command V is actually really handy, but I'm just going to move this into place. I'm going to move this layer down underneath the other layer, right? Now I can start to move this sky around until, you know, it always sort of, the sky always gets like either lighter or darker around that horizon, right? And so I'm going to move this up so that you see that gradient, in this case, moving from darker to lighter a little bit here. And if I want some of these clouds in there, I'm just going to go ahead and make sure that those are in there. You can always pick out a sky based off of this. That's a really bright blue. It's a little too bright for my taste. We can always change the coloration for any layer by going to Image Adjustments, right? We have a number of tools we can use here: brightness and contrast, levels, curves, exposure. That's where we can begin to adjust, well, exposure, brightness, and contrast. Layers and levels and curves allow us to do that, a number of those things all at once in the same tool. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Hue and Saturation in this case. And that box will pop up. Sorry, popped up on my other screen here. I'll move it over so you can see it. I can turn down the saturation if I like, to gray it out or to make it really pop, right? So saturation is the amount of color. You can subtract color or really make it so colorful that your gums want to bleed. But the other nice thing here is that I can actually change the coloration. So I can say colorize, and now I can actually add and adjust it to the color I want. In this case, I'm taking it from a real true blue down to more of a lighter sky blue with a little, just a little warmer. Actually, it's a little cooler. I can turn down the saturation until I like that. I'm going to turn the saturation down a bit. Hit OK. I can also darken the sky or lighten it up. Maybe I'll brighten it up a bit, at the same time. Now you see down here, I have, just patches of nothing, right? Just transparent stuff. In this case, it might be so dark down here that I can get away with darkening this out. I'm going to just create another layer. I'm going to make it down to the very bottom. I'm just going to look at my color palette and hit the default here, black, white, right? You always toggle back and forth, but the one in here in the top foreground is black. I get my brush and let's see here, adjust the size of it. And I can just start to paint in some black down there. So dark down there, you can't even really tell anyway, unless you're really looking for it. You wouldn't have even known if I hadn't told you. Just in case, what I can always do is go to this layer, and to darken this part up, again, I can go to the Dodge Burn tool, right? So the Dodge tool lightens with a brush. I'll go ahead and undo that. Okay. And then the Burn tool, if you click and drag and hold for a minute, you can select the Burn. The Burn tool will actually darken. So I can always darken some things up around here. Make it look like it just gets really dark and dense down there if I want. Okay. Again, I'm always making sure I'm selecting the right layer, right? So I'm trying to darken, in this case, that base rendering, right? And at this point, maybe I just double click on these layers and start to label them. So I'll call this base rendering. Helps to remember what things are. These thumbnails are really tiny, so sometimes it's like, which one is that one? I can't even tell, right? So I'll call this one sky. I'll call this one dark background. All right. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and hit Control S to save. And I'm going to make sure that this is set as a PSD. That'll preserve all my layers for right now. It keeps popping up with boxes, and I'll have to hit OK. Now it's saved. Good deal. All right. So what next? Let's add some material overlays, shall we? Sound good? I can tell you guys are so thrilled. Couple of things here. One, I'm going to go ahead and let's find that concrete, right? So this is a concrete layer. The key thing with these textures is that you think about the scale of them, okay? I'm going to go ahead and just copy, like select everything, Control A, copy, Control C. And now I'm going to Control V this bad boy in. Okay. You can see, I'll just move that layer up. It created a new layer for me. It's up here. All right, this layer is not going to be large enough to cover all of this stuff that I have. So I'm going to copy and paste a couple versions here. I'm just going to try to make sure that things don't repeat too much. Now you're going to see some seams here, right? And I have 4 layers because I've pasted this in 4 times. I'm going to select all 4 of these layers and I'm just going to merge them down. Merge layers. Get them all in the same layer. Now I'm going to try to get rid of these seams and any kind of repetition that you might see of tiling. In this case, I'm going to use the clone stamp tool. Okay, if I hold my cursor over here, clone stamp. This tool is the greatest ever. I'm going to move my cursor over this. I'm going to make sure I have a brush that's feathered. In other words, it sort of blurs out to the edge, right? It fades. I don't want a hard, sharp edge. I want a nice feathered edge. And I'm going to hold down Option and sample a portion. Oops, sorry, here we go. Make sure the clone stamp tool, sample a portion. And now I'm just going to go through and I'm just going to try to fade out where I can any seams that I might see in coloration. So I'm always sort of going back into place and resampling. And then I'm clone stamping out. You can see some, there we go. Try to get some of that repetition out by clone stamping from different directions. Right, now those seams are gone and it's really, oops, you can see a little bit of repetition there. It looks like a little bit of a seam there. All right. Then in general, I just have a concrete texture that I'm going to add. I see someone's added something to the chat. Let me just make sure. What is the Windows alternative for Option? Alt, maybe? It's between the Control and Command on mine. So look at the cursor. When I hit it, the cursor, you see the crosshairs. And it's telling you where you're sampling from at that point. Good question. Alt, okay. At this point, I'm going to turn down the opacity a bit so you can see, right? And I'll go ahead and turn that opacity back up. I'm just going to go and look and see, once I have this filling the screen, I'm just going to go to these settings right here for my concrete layer. I'll go ahead and add the concrete label here, concrete texture. La, 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 la. And I'm just going to pick the type of overlay layer I want it to be. Multiply, color burn, linear burn, dark color, delight and screen, color dodge, linear dodge. There's a number of these. There's overlay, soft light, hard light, vivid. Vivid seems pretty extreme. So maybe just overlay. All right. Now it's overlaid all of the layers below this overlay layer. So the base rendering and the sky and the dark background all have this concrete texture on them. I don't want the concrete texture on the sky, obviously. So we're gonna have to change a few things there, right? All right, so let's do this. What we're going to do is we're going to select portions of the concrete texture layer and just, we'll go ahead and delete that, that part of the layer away, okay? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the base rendering, go ahead and turn off all these other layers. Right, I can always turn them back on, but I'm just turning off their preview right now. I'm gonna go to base rendering. I'm just gonna use the magic wand tool. I'm just gonna select all of the places where we have the background here. Let's see if I get most of it anyway. Yeah, it looks good, a little bit up there. Right, so I got the magic wand selection tool over here. I'm just gonna select, 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 select. And now I'm gonna select the concrete texture tool, or layer, make sure that that's selected. And I'm just going to select the portion, or delete away by hitting delete or backspace, right? The portions of that layer that are, you know, that are in the sky, those open areas, okay? All right, so I selected this concrete texture. I had all of these areas selected, and I can hit delete. You can also add right-click on the base rendering layer and select pixels. Right-click on the base rendering layer. Yeah, exactly. Oh yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's a good point. So again, who was that? That was Caesar that brought that up, right? You can always right-click and then say select pixels here. But what you can do is basically what you're doing is just selecting everything that's not transparent, right? So everything that's has a regular channel, not an alpha channel. Very good. Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks for bringing that up. If for some reason you think you might lose that, the other thing you can do, and this comes in handy for other ways, but I'm just going to go ahead and select these again. Let's say I went to the painstaking task of selecting all of this stuff, and I want to save those selections, even if I want to get rid of those selections temporarily, but I want to bring them back later. Here in the layers box, you have layers tab, channels tab, paths tab. You can go to paths, and you can save your selection as a path. This little icon down at the bottom. So make work path from selection. And so later on, when I go to layers, let's see, I'll just unselect that now. Later on, let's say I want to reselect that again. I can go back to paths. I can select this work path, and I can say make selection from work path. And now I can go back and select something and delete or change the coloration, etc. Okay, so that's where you can sort of save some of these selections that you have in a really quick way. You can also export them out as Illustrator files afterwards. Sometimes that comes in handy, believe it or not, if you're going back and forth between Photoshop and Illustrator for certain things. Again, get in the habit of when your left hand is not busy, hitting Control S or Command S to save. Yeah. All right, just a good habit. You know, in this version that I started with, you know, what I actually did, I was so anal that I actually made different concrete textures and tried to match the perspective of the things that were in the foreground. It turns out it doesn't really make that big of a difference. So I'm not going to really do that here. Let's talk about some of that wood texture. In this case, you know, I'm going to try to think about, you know, some of those materials. Let's see, like this one I found, right? Go ahead and select this, Control A, copy it, Control C, and I'll bring it in, Control V. It's going to fill my screen. In this case, I have a couple of things. I need to scale it, rotate it, and match the perspective. And so I can do that with one simple tool. It's called Edit, Transform. In this case, I'm going to pick Distort. Okay, I have that up. Distort. That'll allow me to select each corner or each vertex. And now I can start to match the perspective that I have here. In this case, I wanted to make like a sort of, let's say inside the parapets here, I have a wood panel deck or something, right? That's what this almost looks like, is sort of wood stained panel, stained deck. And so I'm going to zoom in now, Control plus, Control minus, Command plus, Command minus for the Mac. And I'm just going to make sure that I'm matching that perspective here. It's fairly close. I'm going to zoom out. I can make this an overlay layer as well if I want, right? Let's say maybe a linear burn. But really, I mean, first of all, there's a couple of things here, right? The coloration looks pretty odd. I'm going to turn the sky and the dark background back on. It's overly saturated, right? If I need a pan, I can just hold down the space key in my keyboard, and my cursor turns to a pan handle, and I can just sort of move around. So that's also handy. I'm going to go ahead and just go to Image Adjustments, Hue Saturation. I'm going to turn this down big time. I'm also going to darken it up a bit. Maybe not that much, but you know, again, if it's still too much, you can always turn the transparency down as well. But another thing I'm going to do is it just looks kind of flat, like a carpet or like a wallpaper. And so, you know, obviously there'd be some sort of inside ledge here. And then that would actually cast a shadow on the wood. So here's how some things you can do to sort of fudge that. I'm going to go to my, again, I'm going to go to my Dodge Burn tools. I'm going to select Burn. And I'm going to adjust the size of my cursor. And I'm just going to run along the edge there and darken some of this up. And now I'm just going to go run right along the very edge and really darken that. Just add one more here, add one more going that way. Add a little more of that. Not quite as much shadow there. Sometimes a little dab will do you. I'm just going to back up. There. That looks good. So again, just trying to imply a little bit of three-dimensionality, I think helps sometimes with these things. And then, you know, making a rule. Let's say, you know, some of these things might be wood versus concrete, or some of these might be glass, right? I will point out a really good resource for you guys. I don't know if you guys have ever been to Visualizing Architecture. Alex Holgraff does these. I mean, he's like an absolute magician when it comes to Photoshop. And so things like, let's say, adding reflection and glow to glass, you know, and those sorts of things. I mean, he's absolutely amazing. But he does these tutorials, and they're only like 5 to 8 minutes on YouTube, right? He shows step by step how he does these things for, let's say, you know, he starts with something that looks like this, right? And then, you know, adds the reflections, adds the coloration for glass, adds the material maps and things for wood and stone and concrete, things like that, right? Then adds the entourage like trees and sky in the background, right? So I highly recommend that you just bookmark the site and always go back to it for things, right? Adding grass, adding water, window lights, making things glow, right? A lot of these things are just done with the paintbrush tools and dodge and burn. So getting used to sort of muscle memory with your mouse and in your brushes are quite handy. Okay. I didn't have anybody to like, and I never had a class to teach me like Photoshop or make me use it. So I just sort of learn on my own. Alex has been a really good resource when it comes to doing some more fancy sort of effects here. I could do this again. You know, I could put something in here or something like that. Let's see, why not, right? I'll add maybe another one. Just make sure I'm copying, and where is it? Here it is. And pasting. Oh gosh, there it is. I'll go to, again, edit, transform, and distort. And that way I can start to, again, size and twist this thing into place for, let's say, some perspective here. Maybe I'll add, again, just like I did before, maybe I'll add some of these closer horizontal surfaces. I'll make them sort of decks with some wood decking actually on top of them. I'm just going to sort of zoom in here, move this around, make sure I try to match the perspective as accurately as I can. Parapet's going to be smaller over here because it's further away. Just want to try to correct this up here a bit. All right. Now, obviously, this thing would be occluded by this edge over here. So I'm just going to use the polygonal lasso tool. And I'm just going to try to go from here to here and just sort of draw my own sort of polygon around this map that I just put in and delete it away. All right, the portions that I don't need. I'll do the same thing that I did over here with the other one. So in this case, I think I made this linear burn. I desaturated it, I darkened it up. Let's see, so go to hue saturation, take out some of that coloration, darken it a bit. I'll go ahead and add that burn here. All right. Just sort of fake it a little bit. You know, I did a panel in here, or I could do a panel here. Why don't I do a panel in here? I'll do a panel of it here. Let's see, really quickly. I think I can just paste it back in. Yeah, there we go. And I'm going to go ahead and, again, distort. Again, matching the perspective is always the key to this illusion, right, of how we're doing this stuff. Ay, 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 come on, Photoshop. Here we go. A couple things. First of all, I want this to be vertical. I want this to be horizontal. There we go. Yeah, yeah. All right, it's match perspective time here. Seriously? What's going on, Photoshop? What gives? I don't know why it's not letting me zoom in while I'm using the transform tool. It should. Darn it. I'm just going to make sure, try to quickly match the perspective here. Let's see how I did. Good enough for government work. All right. I'm not going to make this an overlay layer, but I am going to change a few things here. I'm going to take down the saturation, darken it just a tad. But now really it's about painting this burn on. So that brush is a little too small. I'm going to beef that up a bit. Let's go up to maybe 400-ish. Yeah. All right. So now I can add tone and shade where I think I need to, right? Soft shadows again. I don't have any hard shadows in this rendering. So it's a matter of just sort of matching, trying to match things here. Now, maybe I also want to, I'll go back to my base rendering. I'm just going to use the plug and lasso tool. I'm just going to make this edge here. I'm going to darken that up a little bit too, so it matches a little better what I just did with the wood here. Again, I'm sort of anal retentive here, so. I just went over a couple of times, and I didn't quite get that corner there. That's unfortunate. Let me see if I can. So you always have to be careful with your selection tools. All right, well, let me see here. I'll just fix it really quickly with a smaller brush and a harder edge. Much smaller brush. There we go. Not a hard edge. What was I thinking? Bad Josh. All right, there we go. Oh, come on, really? All right, anyway. Oh, dear. All right. That's a hard edge again. What the crap? All right, there we go. Sorry, just try to. Would have been better with the selection there, but anyway. Let's see, what else? Oh, coloration, right? So adding forms for our buildings like those in some of the examples is optional. Yeah, for instance, if you wanted to add, let's say, windows in some of these openings or wood panels or something like that, right? Materiality, I wouldn't add forms, like I wouldn't add more shapes, right? But changing the surfaces, right, in order to sort of make this thing look like an inhabitable buildings rather than just a bunch of like abstract shapes in Rhino, I think is helpful. And again, this is meant to be, help you out with, these sorts of things you should be able to absorb directly into Studio. Extruded buildings that the other examples had. What about adding extruded buildings? That's up to you. If you want to do that, that's fine. Again, that's up to you. That was optional, right? To add like sort of normal buildings. In this example, I didn't have it because it was so dense with these sorts of aggregations, right? Again, this is, let's just talk about that for just a moment, right? I'll go back to the example that you guys have on Canvas here. Maybe, hopefully go to Canvas. Come on, Canvas. Not sure why it takes this long to search. Really? Like Google's down? Come on. I know better than that. Really? Why does it keep opening a different damn tab? Whatever. Come on now. Right, so back to project 3, really quickly, just to address that. This is a good question. But again, if you remember the PDF example, what I've said earlier, here's the example I gave you, just running through this project myself, right? I did one scheme where I had didn't have nearly as many aggregate units. So I added these buildings. Then I had one where it looked, it was just all like aggregate, right? I just had to pick one of these and do a perspective of them. In this case, I think this one actually has some of those existing buildings, right? So it's up to you, right? All right. Again, when it comes to coloration, like at some point in time, I actually like to just sort of, give everything. I have like some brown stuff here, sort of like, the warmer brown orange. I have some of the cooler blues. I could begin to sort of increase the, let's say I wanted to go all warm here, right? I could add another layer. In this case, I'm gonna go just full on crazy here. Maybe I'll go, I'll just create a gradient with some color. At this point, I can quite literally make this, just a color overlay. Let's see, which one would be the best one? Oh, that's really tempting, but it's pretty harsh. Okay, so I'll go with soft light. I'm also going to turn down the opacity so it doesn't bleed things out, right? Okay. And so now I can quite literally, give the overall composition, in this case, a little more, it's like my own Instagram filter, right? So in this case, I can sort of warm things up or cool things down and sort of globally, depending on how I want to do this. Again, if you don't, that's not your cup of tea, that's fine. That's a sort of warmer look. I could always do something different, like cool things off here, in which case maybe I pick a violet. I'll pick a violet for down here. Maybe pick a blue through there. But it'd be the same thing, right? I can begin to, let's see here, soft light that. Turn down its opacity quite a bit. Again, just to give it, you don't want it to be too obscene, right? But just to give it, suddenly that's cooled off big time, right? So anything that was sort of orange is now sort of has a violet tone to it. Okay. Let's see, what else can I do? Right. Is this making sense? Look, again, the photoshopping is key. And again, the idea here is that, by the end, one other thing I could do, I'll just show you this. Sometimes I like it, sometimes I hate this. I'm gonna go ahead and take the base renderer. I'm gonna make a copy of it. or just duplicate it, like duplicate layer here. There it is, right there. I don't know why I couldn't find that. I'm going to make this an overlay layer. It's going to actually darken things up a bit, add some contrast to it. But then if I go to filter, I can do blur, and I can go to Gaussian blur. And what I can do is I can basically just soften this up, so it makes it just a little dreamy, right? So it depends on the look that you're going for, right? You want this to look a little surreal. You have to be careful with this, right? Because you're basically just taking a copy of this and blurring it out a bit, right? Now the sky looks a little weird, so I'd probably do the same thing with the sky. I would just duplicate it and also make that an overlay layer. But then let's see if this will do the same thing. There's not nearly as much detail with it, so let's see what happens here. But you can add maybe a little more of a blur to that sky. All right. You know, if you added something, you know, particularly something off in the distance, you know, I added these birds, for instance. So I'll select them, Control A, Control C to copy, Control V to paste. Oh, that's not good. Where'd the birds go? All right, copy, damn it. There we are. Sorry. Really? Why won't this work? Copy, there we go. Paste. Where are those birds? Come here, birds. I'm gonna go ahead and select these and start to lock them up here. I'll just select them all at once and lock them. Seriously, birds. Here the birds, right? So I have some birds. Those are kind of extremely too large. I can hit Control T to transform, get the generic transform tools here. I can always add these, especially if they're off in the distance. You know, it wouldn't hurt to give these a little bit of a motion blur. So I can go to Filter, Blur, do a motion blur. What motion blur lets you do is determine how much blur there is, right? Little blur or lots of blur, but also the direction that it sort of smears the blur in, which can be helpful when you're talking about things like people running, cars moving in a trajectory, birds flying around in space somewhere. I'll just blur those dudes a little bit there, right? Seriously, all right. Once I do this, I can always save out a version, right? So just save as. I can keep the PSD, so I can always go back and re-edit. I'm actually going to tone down this color layer a little bit. So it's a little too much violet there for my taste. There we are. Save. I can save as a JPEG, right? Let's call this 03 or something. Yeah. I'll go ahead and open up that JPEG. So there are some other settings in here that you can play around with when it comes to the filters. Sometimes you need to actually have the flattened image for it. So for instance, if I go to filter, render, let's say lens flare, let's say I'm J.J. Abrams, I really want to lens flare this bad boy, right? Then I can actually choose a location for the sun to be shining through. I can change the size of it and the brightness of it. I can change the camera type. That's a bit extreme. Sorry. Oh boy, it's going to be one of those. It's a good thing. It's a good thing it's a long weekend coming up. Oh, that's all I gotta say about that. All right, I could always add that. Usually when you have that bright of a spot over here, the stuff around it would actually be silhouetted, right? And so probably what I would do is if I'm going to pick this spot to be a place for a light to be protruding through, first I'd be a little more careful about where it's coming through. Maybe I'd pick this corner. But then I would go back to my PSD and I would take this, this base layer, right? Let's see, where was I looking at? Here it is, right? So I'd pick this base rendering layer, unlock it, of course. I'd use that burn tool. I'd up the size of the brush here. And I would go around and start to darken some of this stuff up here so that it would be a little more evenly silhouetted around where that's coming through. So let's say I do that. I save as, again, this JPEG, resave it out. Let's see here. Where is it? I think I did it as 03, right? Replace. Could not save because it's already open. That's a rookie mistake. Come on, Bush League, Josh. That's Bush League. Don't save. All right, now save as. Here we go. So you can take some artistic liberty with that dodge and burn, and those tools really are helpful. They're helpful to add soft shadows underneath trees or silhouettes of people and things like that. You know, to imply tone or to imply highlights with the dodge part. Let's see if I can actually get this to look good or not. Filter, stylize, render. We'll just throw every effect at this. This is ridiculous, but you know, it is what it is. Try it there. There we go. Okay, well, whatever. All right, and so, you know, after a while, you know, again, it's just to again, give this a little bit of atmosphere, right? And I think that's the key word, atmosphere, right? Maybe it's dystopian, maybe it's a very optimistic view of the future, right? But suffice to say, you know, the sort of tone or atmosphere that you give your overall drawings, right? Elevations, sections, when you add tone and shadows in your sections, your perspectives, your eye level perspectives, the sorts of entourage that you add, right? All of that sort of contributes to the overall mood and therefore the overall effect and tone that you're setting visually, and it should really match what you're talking about orally, right? So anyway, I'm just going through some of the motions here. This is recorded, and so this will be posted on YouTube as well. But this is just, you know, Photoshop 101 for some of the stuff you might have forgotten from Studio last year, or for 267 a year and a half or 2 years ago for some of you. Okay. Could try to find some sweet hot air balloons to put in here. Pretend it's Las Vegas. There's always hot air balloons going over. But at least there used to be. I don't know. I haven't seen them so often. They used to land right next to our house. No, now I moved out towards Mountain's Edge, so I don't see so many hot air balloons anymore. Well, any quick questions, or can I be of any help? And like I said, and I mentioned this at the beginning, but I'll repeat it, you know, I'm very particular. I don't really like to screw around with rendering a lot. So I'll just take the default Rhino crap soft clay model rendering, you know, with soft shadows, and then I'll try to bling it out as much as possible in Photoshop. But, you know, some of you, you know, probably like V-Ray or Lumion or what's some of the other ones that aren't coming to mind right now. Third-party plugins that work with Rhino and SketchUp and Studio Max and those, you know, or work with what's the other one? Revit, right? You know, if you're really good at using those textures and maps, that's fine. But again, make sure that you're really sort of setting a nice atmosphere. Okay, and again, a lot of these things are done in Photoshop. I mean, I never like model trees or modeled humans. I had those things in Photoshop or Illustrator afterwards, right? And so, you know, a lot of things like vegetation, soft things, right? Like human figures, animals, grass, ground cover, shrubbery, trees, vegetation, shrubbery. Did I just say shrubbery? I'm Roger the Shrubber. I arrange, design, and sell shrubberies. All right. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to turn off the recording.